How many mornings can a town watch a woman left bleeding before somebody finally decides to look? In Cross Creek, the answer would change everything. One man, rich enough to stop it, and the widow he chose to marry became the last person that town ever expected to fear. Her name was Sadie Coleman, 26 years old, and on the July morning this story truly begins. She did not yet know the rancher's name at all. She only knew the taste of dirt in her mouth and the sound of an entire street pretending not to hear her. Before we go back to that morning, tap join beside the channel name and become a member. It takes 10 seconds, and it's what keeps stories like this one coming. Sadie had not been in Cross Creek 2 full months, and already the town had decided who she was before most of them had spoken a word to her. She'd come down out of the northern hills on foot, no horse, no wagon, nothing but a dress plastered to her skin, and a wedding band gone black with tarnish. The spring flood that took her husband Thomas had taken everything else besides: the cabin they'd built with their own hands, the small flock of sheep, even the grave she'd tried to dig before the ground turned to soup beneath her fingers. She walked 3 days on a fistful of dried corn, past bone-dry arroyos and burnt fence lines, and made it as far as the mercantile before her legs simply stopped agreeing to hold her upright. She woke on a cot in a back room that smelled of tobacco smoke and mildew, a thin gray blanket thrown over her more from obligation than kindness. A woman named Nettie sat in the corner, arms crossed, watching her the way a person watches a stray dog that might be carrying something worse than fleas. "You got people here?" Sadie shook her head. "Money?" Another shake. "Then you can't stay." Nettie's voice carried no real unkindness, only a tiredness worn down to the bone. "There's a boarding house 2 streets over. Mrs. Odell might have work for someone willing." Odell looked her up and down the way a tax collector eyes a debt already 3 years overdue. $2 a week, meals included, and a room in the cellar, low ceiling to damp along every seam, a bucket in the corner, and a single grated window just wide enough to watch other people's boots pass by all day without ever once slowing down. It was nothing at all. It was also everything Sadie had left in the world. She took it before the offer could be pulled back. The work itself was brutal. Laundry for the cattlemen who drifted through town, water hauled bucket by bucket until her shoulders screamed in protest, bed sheets scrubbed against a washboard until her knuckles split open and bled into the gray water. And within that first week the whispers had already started, drifting through doorways and cutting off the moment she stepped inside a room. The widow, who arrived the very week the McCormick livestock started sickening. The stranger, with bruises nobody could quite explain. Bad luck walking around on 2 legs, looking for somewhere new to settle. None of it held together under any real scrutiny. A sick cow had passed fever through the rest of the herd, plain as daylight to anyone willing to look. But Sadie had ridden in that same week, and in a town like Cross Creek, coincidence was worth more. The first real cruelty landed on a Saturday evening, a basket of clean laundry balanced against her hip, when a ranch hand named Dutch Radley stepped square into her path with 2 friends trailing behind him, whiskey loud and hunting for someone to bleed their boredom onto. Well, look who it is, the widow witch herself. He shoved her hard enough to spill the fresh sheets into the mud, and when she knelt to gather them back up, his boot found her ribs. Almost lazy about the whole business, the kind of casual, "That's where you belong, in the dirt with the rest of the garbage. His friends laughed as they walked off, and not one soul on that street so much as broke stride. It became routine after that. Stones thrown by children who'd learned the word witch from their own fathers at the supper table. Sour milk poured deliberately over freshly hung wash. Service flatly refused at the butcher's counter. Someone put a rock through the little grated pane of her cellar room in the dead of night. Word of it never once reached Mrs. Odell's lips, which only meant she'd already heard, which meant it would keep right on happening. And it did, over and over, because the thing nobody tells you about becoming a whole town's scapegoat is that it hands out permission the way a saloon hands out drinks, free and generous to anyone willing to take it. Every cheated deal, every dead calf, every petty grievance in Cross Creek got quietly laid at Sadie's feet until she wasn't quite a person to most of them anymore. She had turned, in their eyes, into a story they told each other to feel a little less small about their own meanness. She thought about leaving nearly every night in that damp cellar, counting the handful of coins that would never stretch far enough across open desert to matter. So she stayed instead and endured and worked and waited for something, anything at all, to finally shift. It shifted on a sweltering afternoon in late August, the day of the cattle auction, when the whole of Main Street, filled up with penned steers and shouting buyers and whiskey deals, struck loud under a merciless noon sun. Sadie was carrying an armload of fresh linens toward the visiting rancher's hotel when Dutch Radley staggered out of the saloon, drunker than she had ever once seen him, and spotted her the way a hawk spots something small and slow-moving across open ground. Look who it is, loud enough to turn half the street. The Cross Creek curse out for a stroll. She tried simply to walk past. He wouldn't allow it. He tore the linen straight from her arms and flung them down into the dirt, and when she dropped to gather them back up, his boot kicked her hands away entirely. Stay down where you belong. He shoved her again, real force behind it this time, and she went sprawling backward into the dust. The wind knocked clean out of her lungs in one violent instant. The street went dead silent. Dozens of people turned to watch a woman lying flat in the road, and not a single one of them stepped forward. Whatever had been slowly bending inside Sadie for months finally reached the very bottom. She looked up at Radley through the hair fallen loose across her face and felt, for the first time since the flood took her old life, something that was not fear at all. That's enough. The voice cut across the street like a rifle crack, and every head turned at once toward it. A man was walking through the crowd, tall, broad through the shoulders, dressed in dust-colored black, with his hat pulled low over his eyes, and the crowd, without a single word between them, simply parted to let him pass. "This ain't your business, Hale." Some of Radley's swagger had already crept back into his voice. "You're making a scene at my own auction." The stranger's voice stayed quiet, almost conversational, and that very quiet was somehow worse than shouting, enough to raise the hair along Sadie's arms where she still lay in the dirt. "That makes it my business." Beckett Hale stopped a few feet short and looked down at Radley with an expression carved out of river stone. "She's half your size, and you knocked her flat in front of 100 witnesses, proud of yourself." Radley's face flushed red. "She's cursed everybody in this town, or you're just proving what kind of man you are by beating on someone who can't fight back." Hale's hand drifted near his belt, not on the revolver itself, close enough that the threat needed no further words attached to it. "My rules say a man doesn't lay a hand on a woman anywhere. I can see it. Apologize. Now, Radley looked around for backing and found nothing but lowered eyes. Sorry. Not once looking at Sadie, louder. Sorry. Get out of my sight before I decide that wasn't enough. Radley ran. His friends followed close behind him. The show was over, and Main Street returned to its business as though nothing at all had happened, except that Beckett Hale was still there, and extended down toward a woman he'd never once met before that moment. She stared at his hand a long, careful moment. In her experience, a man's help always came with a bill attached, presented later when you had the least strength left to refuse it. But she also knew she couldn't sit in the dirt forever, waiting for the world to improve on its own, so she took it, and he pulled her upright without any apparent effort, then stepped back to give her room to breathe. You hurt? I'll be fine. That's not what I asked. A thin, tired smile. I've had worse. Something crossed his face at that, anger maybe, though she couldn't quite tell whether it was aimed at her or at the whole rotten town around them. He gathered the scattered linens himself, shook the dust, free-handed them back, then removed his hat entirely, holding it against his chest like something owed. Ma'am, I'm sorry you had to live through that in a town that carries my name on half its deeds. Nobody had called her ma'am in months. Nobody had apologized for anything at all since the river took her old life away from her. Isn't it your fault, then? She managed. It is, plain. No hesitation in it at all. I own half the land around Cross Creek. I employ half the men working it. He learned her name, Sadie Coleman. Learned she had no family within 1,000 miles and no friends inside the town limits. And then, in front of the whole slowly dispersing crowd, he wanted to know how long she'd been here and how many mornings something like this had already happened to her. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her face, bruises, stacked in 3 separate stages of healing, answered plainly enough on its own. I'm going to ask you something and you can say no, and I will respect that completely. A pause, deliberate. But I'm asking anyway because I believe we might be able to help each other. I need a wife. Of everything Sadie had steeled herself to hear that afternoon, that particular sentence was nowhere on the list. Not for anything improper. He'd caught the alarm crossing her face. I have a ranch, 3 hours, out past the canyon rim. Good land, isolated and dangerous besides, because I have enemies out there who remember me. My last housekeeper quit from nothing but the loneliness of it. A wife is different, protected under the law, respected by custom, and anyone who knows my name knows I take care of what belongs to me. Quieter. I know you've survived 6 weeks here as this town's favorite target. I know you got knocked flat in the street today and still climbed back up on your own. And I know plainly enough that you have nowhere else in this world left to go. That last part landed like a closed fist because it was entirely true, and because he could apparently see it as clearly as anyone else in Cross Creek. I need a little time to think it through. You have until sundown tomorrow. After that, I ride back out for the ranch regardless. That night, lying awake in the damp cellar, Mrs. Odell handed over a piece of advice nobody had asked her for. Beckett Hale had killed men more than folks around here cared to discuss openly. His first wife died out there under circumstances nobody much liked to bring up either. His ranch sat 3 hours from anything resembling civilization, and the men who worked for him stayed loyal because he paid them well and frightened them plenty besides. If you stay here instead, though, the older woman warned, not unkindly, you'll likely be dead within a year. Radley's hardly the only man in this town who'd sooner see you gone for good. It wasn't much of a choice between two evils, but by the following sundown, Sadie had already made it anyway. Quick pause before she gives her answer. If you want more stories where quiet strength finally gets what it's owed, tap Join beside the channel, name and become a member. She found Beckett at the hotel finishing his auction business, and she went in carrying her questions ready in both hands. Why me? You could marry practically anyone, someone without your reputation trailing behind them. I could. But good families come bundled with expectations I have no use for. I want someone practical. Someone who understands the world is hard and doesn't need shielding from that particular fact of it, she asked then about his first wife. His expression didn't change on the surface, but something moved behind his eyes all the same. Margaret, childbirth, took her. The baby didn't survive either. We were simply too far from any doctor, and by the time I understood how badly it had gone, it was already too late to fix a long breath. I loved her. I wasn't a good enough husband while she lived, but I loved her, and her death sits on my ledger for bringing her out that far in the first place. The rawness of that honesty caught Sadie off her guard entirely. She had braced herself for excuses, not a confession this bare. If I say yes, and it turns out later that you want something I'm not willing to give, simple as naming the weather. I'll teach you to ride, to shoot straight, to know this land the way I know it. If I ever once cross a line with you, put a bullet through me yourself. There's a sheriff 3 counties over who would throw a party over it. It was the least romantic proposal a woman could possibly imagine, and somehow that very fact made it the most believable thing anyone had put to her. All right, I'll do it. They married at dawn the next morning, 10 minutes and a $5 fee, a traveling preacher who asked no questions of either party, a sleeping dog serving as their only witness. Sadie wore the same torn dress she had worn for weeks running. Beckett wore black. No other guests came, and when they finally rode out past the edge of town in a wagon loaded with supplies, not one soul in Cross Creek so much as paused in the street to watch the widow leave for good. Why would they? Their curse was finally riding off on its own accord. The country grew rougher as they climbed higher, red canyon walls rising sheer on either side of what felt more like a goat path than any proper road, until they finally crested a rise and the whole valley opened wide beneath them, green pasture cut clean by a glittering river. A 2-story ranch house, solid and square at the far end, with its outbuildings clustered close around it. Welcome home. 3 men waited near the porch as the wagon rolled in. Mateo, weathered brown and watchful, his young nephew Raphael shuffling his boots nervously in the dirt, and old Dobbs, who spat tobacco juice and studied her the unhurried way a man appraises a new horse before he'll commit to buying it. This is my wife Sadie. She runs the house from today forward. Any question about supplies or schedules you bring straight to her. The house itself proved clean but bare, plainly the domain of men who had long since stopped noticing their own dust. Your room's upstairs, first door on the right, there's a lock on it. Use it whenever you like. I won't take offense either way. She set her single travel bag down inside a house that was somehow hers now, married 2 days into knowing a man she still barely understood, in a valley so remote she couldn't spot a way back out of it in any direction she turned to look. That first week became penance disguised carefully as housework. Sadie scrubbing floors and beating rugs until her hands cramped from it, needing badly to feel useful somewhere that still felt borrowed rather than earned. The hired hands kept a careful distance at first, polite enough, but plainly wary of the stranger their boss had ridden home with. Then, on the 5th morning, she made biscuits from her late mother's recipe, still warm when she set the plate down on the table, and Mateo's eyebrows climbed on the very first bite. These are good, real surprise in his voice. Next dawn he knocked apologetically at her door before sunup to ask whether she might also know how to brew coffee that didn't taste faintly of creek water. From that morning forward, the hands started showing up for breakfast instead of grabbing food on the run and vanishing, trading easy stories about fence lines and stubborn cattle, while Sadie slowly learned the shape of this strange new life, one quiet morning at a time. She came to learn Beckett, too, in careful pieces. He woke well before sunrise without exception, walked the fence line each day hunting for breaks, and never once asked a hand to do a thing he wasn't already doing himself. He spoke little, but people listened close whenever he did, because he never wasted a word on anything that didn't matter. And she noticed, too, exactly how alone he remained, even seated at his own crowded table, how he'd start a sentence and abandon it partway through, how he'd stand out on the porch after dark, smoking and staring toward the mountains until the emptiness settling over his face made her own chest ache with an old familiar recognition. She'd worn that same exact look once, back in Cross Creek, on her worst nights. 2 weeks into the marriage, she woke to shouting down the hall and found Beckett's door standing ajar, a lamp shattered across the floorboards, a chair overturned, the man himself sitting on the edge of his bed with his head in both hands, breathing like he'd sprinted for miles in the dark. Nightmare? Something like that. She sat beside him, without reaching to touch him, simply present, until his breathing finally leveled out. I'd dream about being too slow to save her. 5 years gone, and it never gets any easier, only different somehow. My husband drowned in the flood. Her voice stayed quiet. I couldn't reach him in time. The current was too fast, and I wasn't strong enough to fight it, and I watched him go under. I still hear him sometimes, awake and asleep, both. They sat together with their shared damage laid bare in the dark, neither one fixing the other, simply no longer carrying it entirely alone, and something between them shifted quietly that night from arrangement into partnership, unhurried. The peace didn't hold for long. Sadie found it during her morning rounds a month later, a dead crow nailed flat to the fence post nearest the canyon trail. Wings spread wide, its eyes gone, 3 words carved deep into the wood beneath it. Remember your debts. She fetched Beckett without wasting a single word, and his expression went flat and hard the instant he saw it for himself. Old business. I wasn't always a rancher. I rode with a crew out of Denver once. Robbery mostly, some worse than that. It went bad in the worst possible way, and most of us died in a shootout against federal marshals. I got clear. A man named Cyrus Vane did not. A long pause. He believes I owe him everything I've built out here since. This land, this cattle, my whole remaining life, probably, for every man who didn't make it home that night. I'm not leaving before he could offer her any way out of it. I've already been run out of one place in my life. I refuse to do it a second time. Something that looked very much like respect crossed his face at that. Then we prepare properly, because Vane never once makes a threat he doesn't fully intend to keep. He turned the ranch into something close to a fortress within the week. Every fence line checked twice over, every gun cleaned and loaded, the cattle drawn in tight around the house itself. And he began, in earnest, to teach her how to shoot. They went out to a clearing behind the barn each afternoon. Empty bottles lined along a fence rail, Sadie's shoulder blooming a deep purple bruise from the rifle's steady kick. I don't know if I can do this after missing badly, a dozen times running. You can, you simply haven't needed to yet. Think of it as protecting yourself, never as taking a life. Everyone eventually reaches that single moment where it's your life or theirs, with no middle ground left standing between the two. If that moment ever comes for you, you'll do exactly what needs doing. 3 weeks after the crow appeared, Raphael came sprinting in from the north pasture, badly out of breath. Riders, 6 of them, coming in fast. Beckett was already out on the porch with his rifle raised by the time the dust cloud crested the canyon trail. Sadie took the second-floor window exactly as he'd taught her, covering the high ground while Mateo and Dobbs flanked the porch below with rifles of their own. The 6 riders drew up 30 feet short of the house. Their leader sat lean in the saddle, a scar running clean from temple to jaw, and the smile he wore carried no warmth in it at all. Dorian Hale. Been a long while, not nearly long enough. Cyrus Vane laid out his ledger of a debt owed in blood and prison years, and Beckett laid the truth back at him in return, a warning ignored, good men dead because Vane had wanted one final score too many. You owe me this whole ranch, or you'll owe me in blood instead, one way or the other. I owe you nothing at all. Ride out now, or force this and learn exactly how it ends. Your choice entirely. Vane's eyes drifted lazily up toward the window where Sadie sat, with her rifle trained steady on his chest. That pretty new wife of yours must be something truly special for you to finally climb out of mourning for her sake. You go anywhere near her, and I will kill you myself. Not a threat, a promise, plain and simple. Vane only laughed low in his throat, turned his horse unhurried, and rode out slow, taking his own sweet time about it, because men who carry no fear of you never do hurry off. The attack came 5 nights later, in that pitch-black hour, when even the moon had already dropped below the ridge. Sadie woke to breaking glass and the terrible screaming of frightened animals on her feet, with the rifle in hand before she was fully conscious of moving at all. They're burning the barn! Already half-dressed, already moving fast toward the door. Stay here. She did not stay. Flames were already climbing 30 feet into the black sky by the time she reached the porch, silhouettes cutting through drifting smoke, gunfire cracking sharp from every direction at once. A man rose out of the haze with a pistol raised toward the house, and Sadie fired without letting herself think it through. The kick threw her back a full step, and he went down hard. She had just shot a living person. She braced for something enormous to hit her afterward. Instead, she felt only cold and strangely focused, and there simply wasn't time left over to feel anything else at all. Vane himself came at Beckett's exposed back with a raised pistol. Sadie fired again and missed clean, and Beckett threw himself bodily between them, driving Vane down hard into the dirt. Someone seized her from behind in the smoke, an arm crushing her windpipe shut, her vision beginning to gray at the edges, until Raphael appeared out of the haze and swung a shovel square into her attacker's skull. She dropped to her knees, gasping for air, while, a few yards off, Beckett pinned Vane face down with a gun pressed hard to the back of his skull, his finger already tightening on the trigger. "Give me one good reason." Low, almost calm. "Because you've gone soft." Vane spat through a mouthful of blood. "Because you already know pulling that trigger makes you everything you once swore you'd never become again." Dobbs laid a steadying hand on Beckett's shoulder before the thought could finish itself. "Law can have him now. We've got witnesses standing right here. Let him burn for it, legal." Beckett's hand shook once hard, and then, slowly, he drew the gun back. The sheriff rode in 3 days later and hauled Vane and what little remained of his gang off in iron chains. Instead, it only felt like exhaustion being granted permission, at long last, to rest. Standing amid the wreckage of the barn afterward, Beckett let her know she could still leave if she wanted. Nobody in the territory would think less of her after surviving all this. "I'm not leaving. This is my home too now, and I'm entirely done running from fights that find me anyway." He took her hand, then the first time he'd reached for her voluntarily since their wedding morning, and thanked her, quietly, for staying, for fighting beside him, for turning out stronger than he'd ever had any right to expect from a stranger he'd married on a whim. Winter came hard and stayed long, and by the time spring finally softened the mud along the river, the ranch had healed into something Sadie had honestly stopped expecting to feel again, something close, at last, to belonging somewhere. She was kneading bread in the kitchen when she heard a single rider approaching much too fast, and reached for the rifle by pure habit alone. But the rider who crested the rise and slid straight off her horse into the yard was a girl of maybe 17, bruises covering half her face, ribs held carefully like broken glass. "Please." Her voice cracked before she even hit the ground. "He'll kill me if I go back there." Her name was Ruth. Her father had beaten her for shaming the family name, and someone back in town had whispered there was a woman living out past the canyon who had survived Cross Creek herself and might actually understand. Sadie carried her inside with her own 2 arms, cleaned every wound herself, and recognized each bruise intimately because she had once worn the very same marks. "You're safe, here, now. If your father comes looking, he has to go through me first." Beckett watched from the doorway and offered nothing more than a nod and a low. "I'm with you, whatever comes of this." It was the second person Sadie had taken in without asking anyone's permission first. The first had been herself that night she'd agreed to a stranger's hotel proposal, and something in that plain truth settled into her like a foundation stone. Ruth's father rode in 2 weeks later with a pair of hard-eyed men trailing behind him, demanding his property returned. Sadie met him right at the porch steps with garden dirt still caked under her fingernails. "Your daughter isn't property. She's a person, and she is staying here." He named her a thief, cursed her name outright, announced flatly that he took no orders from women, and found himself staring instead at Beckett, Mateo, Dobbs, and Raphael, every one of them armed and none of them so much as blinking. "You'll leave her be, or you'll learn firsthand exactly why 5 separate territories already know my name." The man's rage curdled fast into something far smaller once the numbers finally sank in, and he rode off, cursing under his breath but entirely empty-handed, never once returning. Ruth, that same evening, sitting close beside Sadie on the porch steps as the light faded. "I never want to feel helpless again, as long as I live." So Sadie taught her the exact way she herself had once been taught. Patient hands correcting a wild, panicked grip, breathing steadied carefully before ever pulling a trigger, a promise extracted in fair return. You use what I teach you to protect people, never to punish them. You grow strong to stay safe, not to become the very thing you already hate. Ruth promised, and clearly meant every word of it, and within a single season, she had become Sadie's near-constant shadow around the ranch, quick with a rifle and quicker still to comfort whatever frightened new arrival, because Ruth was hardly the last one. Word carries strange distances across hard country, and within a year the ranch had become something far larger than simply Beckett Hale's private property. A place broken women rode toward when nowhere else on earth would take them in, a refuge carved straight out of canyon rock, where survival became the floor and never once the ceiling above it. Sadie fed them, armed them, taught them, and slowly the once isolated valley filled up with fresh cabins and new voices, and children who had never once in their short lives gone hungry. It was exactly that growing community Vane's surviving men came for, on a moonless night deep in late January, torches thrown hard against the new house's south wall, while riders circled outside firing wildly into the darkness, more interested in spreading raw panic than in aiming true at anyone. Sadie herded the women and children toward the barn, positioned everyone who could shoot along the windows, and fought until the rifle barrel scorched clean across both her palms. When the raiders finally broke off and retreated into the dark, the new house stood a smoking ruin. 2 people lay wounded, and nearly everything Sadie had spent a full year carefully building lay half in ashes at her own feet. I'm going after them, ending this completely, once and for all. That's suicide. You don't even know where their camp sits. I'll find it. And when I do, they'll finally understand that coming after us was the worst mistake of their entire lives. He argued hard, and she held her ground harder still. Because if she died out there alone, at least everyone remaining here still had a fighting chance. And if she stayed instead and the gang simply returned again, someone has to stay behind and protect these people. That someone is you. She tracked the gang 2 full days through the Badlands, found their camp glowing by its own firelight tucked deep in a narrow canyon, and moved on it well after full dark, quiet as a held breath drawn tight. When it was finally over, the fight brief and brutal, lit only by their own dying fire, Cyrus Vane lay bleeding out in the snow, out of men, and entirely out of time. You're no better than I am, a killer, same as I've always been. Maybe so, but I'm the particular kind of killer that protects people from monsters, exactly like you. And if that's what the world needs me to be, then I'll gladly be it. She left him there in the snow and rode 3 days straight for home, wounded worse than she'd first realized, a fever climbing steadily up from a deep knife cut along her ribs, the whole landscape blurring white before her, until she finally collapsed at the ranch boundary. Without once setting her down, she healed slowly after that, the sheer weight of what she'd done sitting on her chest, like a stone she couldn't quite manage to set back down again. You did what needed doing. One quiet evening, weeks on. I didn't feel anything at all while I was doing it. What does that make me now? Human. Exhausted. Someone who survived far more than any person reasonably should have to, and still made an impossible choice anyway when the moment finally came for it. There's a real difference between that and cruelty, and some part of you already knows it plainly. He let the words settle in the dark kitchen a long while before either of them spoke again. Before we finish this story, if a widow who rose from the dirt to become the safest name in the territory is worth your time, become a channel member and tap Join. Spring arrived again, and the whole community raised a new house together. Bigger this time, room enough inside it for everyone who might still come riding in out of the dark someday. News of what had happened at Vane's old camp spread quickly through the territory. Some named Sadie a murderess outright. More spoke of her as something far closer to a legend, and either way, nobody troubled the ranch again after that winter. Families started arriving alongside the broken women now too, fleeing simple poverty as often as outright cruelty, and the whole operation grew wide enough to hold them all. More cattle, more crops, more cabins climbing steadily up the valley floor. It stopped being simply Hale's ranch somewhere along the way. It became a true refuge with Sadie's own name quietly stitched through every board of it. The years that followed were kind in the particular way. Hard-won years always are. Slow and steady and thoroughly earned. Ruth grew into Sadie's right hand in full, teaching every new arrival the same exact skills she'd once been taught herself, fierce and gentle, in precisely the right measure. Sadie's hair silvered gradually, her hands scarred and steady as ever, and still she could outshoot most men across the whole territory and outwork nearly all the rest besides. Beckett grew old, right alongside her, slower with every passing winter, but never once distant, and one evening out on the porch watching the sun drop behind the very ridge they'd first crossed together as complete strangers, he finally spoke a word neither of them had voiced aloud across 8 full years of partnership. "I love you, I know. I've known for quite a while now. I love you too. Have since the moment you threw yourself between me and everything that ever came after us. Maybe even before that. It hardly matters when it started. Only that it's real, and that it stayed. When Beckett finally passed, it came peacefully. Old age, nothing dramatic about it at all. Asleep beside her one ordinary night, and simply gone come morning light. Sadie buried him in the orchard he'd planted their very first spring together, carved his name into a plain stone with her own hands, and grieved the exact way she had learned to handle everything by then, quietly, and without ever once breaking apart. His passing put the ranch's whole legal footing at risk, since on paper the land had only ever belonged to him alone. So Sadie rode into the territorial capital herself, sat through 2 full months of lawyers and paperwork, and filed the entire property as a trust that could never again be sold or seized by any single hand. She rode home no longer merely a rancher's widow, but the founder of something purpose-built to outlast her completely. More years passed steadily by, and Sadie trained Ruth to lead exactly the way she herself had once been trained, never to become a copy of anyone at all, but to become someone fully capable of standing entirely on her own 2 feet. "I'm scared I'll fail you somehow, Ruth." Years deep into her own marriage by then, her own children underfoot along the porch steps. "You won't do what I did. You'll do exactly what your own time asks of you, with your own particular strength. That was always the entire point of all this. You'll find your own Cyrus Vane to face down someday, and you'll survive it too, because that's simply what this place does. Now we survive, and then we turn straight around and help the next person survive as well. That's the whole legacy, passed hand to hand." On her very last afternoon, Sadie sat on that same worn porch with Ruth close beside her, watching children play out in a yard who had never once known what real fear even felt like, who assumed safety was simply how the entire world worked instead of something someone had once fought hard to build for them. I believe we did all right in the end. You did far more than all right. You changed the whole world, or at least our own small corner of it. That's genuinely all. Her eyes closed at last, tired in the deep and thoroughly satisfied way of a life fully spent down to its very last coin. Keep teaching every one of them that strength was never the same thing as cruelty. That's all I ask of you now. She passed that same night, surrounded entirely by the family she had built from nothing but a bruised jaw and one flat refusal to stay down in the dirt, and they buried her right beside Beckett in the orchard, her name carved simple into the stone next to his own. She survived, she protected, she mattered. The ranch carried on, long after both of them were gone from it, generation after generation passing through its gates, every single one of them leaving a little stronger than they'd first arrived. And somewhere back where this whole story started, in a town called Cross Creek that once watched a woman left bleeding in its own street and simply looked away morning after morning, they tell it rather differently now, not as a story of some curse nobody wanted near them. And the widow he chose to shield rose all the way up and proved once and for all that strength used to protect will always, in the end, outlast strength used only to dominate.